The chill of early dawn, sharp as fractured glass, clung to Margaret Calloway, with a tenacity that mirrored the grief for her late husband, the Reverend Alistair Calloway. It was a presence more persistent than the fading scent of him in their sparsely furnished cabin, a sentinel standing guard over her 6 months of widowhood. This land, near what some still called the old frontier, was meant to be her solace, a place where memories like the prairie winds whispered ceaselessly but benignly. But this morning, the whispers had turned guttural, bearing an edge of disquiet. She'd felt it even before rising. An unnatural stillness in the air, the kind that often presaged a storm. Yet the sky was a clear, innocent canvas of pre-dawn indigo. Then from the ancient willow that marked her property's western edge, she'd heard it, or thought she had. Faint, almost subaudible murmurs, like a sighing chorus of lost voices, carried on a wind that wasn't blowing. Dismissing it as a trick of tired ears, she'd risen. By the first sliver of light, she'd seen it from her window, a crude wooden stake, unpainted and unfamiliar, driven into the earth near the willow, a dark exclamation point against the nascent glow. Attached to its raw summit by a grimy piece of twine was a tattered fragment of what looked like dark homespun cloth, stiff with an unidentifiable stain that made her stomach clench. Her garden, a hard-won riot of determined vegetables and a few stubborn flowers, her sanctuary now felt violated. The true violation, however, was the figure silhouetted against the brightening east, moving with a frantic, almost desperate energy amidst her burgeoning squash vines. Margaret's heart, a wild bird, slammed against the cage of her ribs. Her hand, seemingly of its own accord, found the heavy iron poker beside the hearth, its cold, pitted surface a small, inadequate reassurance. Her bare feet were silent on the dew-damp grass as she approached the edge of her cultivated plot, the alien stake and its gruesome pennant, a silent accusation. The man was native, his frame lean and wiry, beneath ragged earth-stained buckskins that seemed to melt into the soil he was desecrating. His black hair, streaked with premature silver, like frost on winter branches, hung lank around a face carved by a lifetime of hardship, each line a stark testament to sorrows she could only guess at. He dug with a desperate, almost feral intensity, his bare hands flinging aside dark, rich soil, heedless of the tender roots he tore, heedless of the fat green squash he dislodged. He muttered a low, guttural litany. They come back, no time must find her, before they pave her soul. The words fractured as they were sent a fresh tremor of unease through Margaret. Beside him, a small disturbed patch of earth, looked recently frantically turned over and then hastily smoothed. Stop, Margaret commanded, her voice emerging with a firmness that belied the tremor in her hands. Stop this instant. What are you doing in my garden? The man froze, his head snapping up, his eyes dark and deep-set, burned with a feverish light, like coals stirred in a dying fire. For a long, breathless moment, he simply stared, a cornered animal, and Margaret tightened her grip on the poker, her knuckles white. Then a profound shudder ran through him, a weariness so immense it seemed to settle into his very bones, dimming the frantic light in his eyes to a dull ache. He gestured with a trembling, soil-caked hand toward the spot near the base of the gnarled willow not far from the strange stake. Its ancient branches wept towards the earth, heavy with secrets. They made me bury her here. He said, his voice a raw, cracking whisper, like dry leaves skittering across stone. The English was accented yet hauntingly intelligible. Here, under the willow. Margaret lowered the poker, fractionally, confusion warring with her ingrained fear. Who? What are you talking about? He pushed himself to his feet, swaying a gaunt figure against the sunrise. My wife, Celia. He pressed a hand to his chest, as if to physically staunch an old, unhealing wound that still bled grief. They took her. And then they made me put her in the ground. Right here. The name Celia resonated faintly, a half-forgotten echo from the town's older gossip tales Margaret had mostly dismissed as the melancholic ramblings of frontier loneliness, or the morbid fabrications of bored tongues. A white settler woman who had vanished decades ago. Some said she'd run off with a charismatic peddler. Others whispered darker things, native raids, solitary madness, that led her into the unforgiving wilderness. No one ever spoke of a burial. The man's gaze was fixed on the willow, an intensity of longing and pain that was unnervingly potent, a silent scream that seemed to warp the very air around him. "I am Ash Talon," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of its former strength, a hint of a pride that even abject misery could not entirely extinguish. "I was her husband, Ash Talon." The name struck Margaret with the force of a physical blow. A warrior, a renegade spoken of in hushed, fearful tones by the older settlers, a specter from the bloody conflicts that had scarred this land before peace. Uneasy, fragile, had settled like a thin layer of dust over smoldering embers. He was a legend, a ghost story whispered by firesides to frighten children, a man long believed dead, killed in some forgotten skirmish or vanished into the vast, unmapped territories to the west. Yet here he stood, flesh and blood, covered in her garden soil, his eyes burning with a grief that felt as fresh and raw as the morning dew on her disturbed plants. The new wooden stake with its ominous fabric scrap suddenly felt like a harbinger. Margaret found her voice, though it trembled like a leaf in the rising wind. That cannot be. This land was fallow then, unused for many years before the church acquired it for my husband's parsonage. She had checked the deeds. Alistair had been meticulous. Ash Talon shook his head, a slow, tired motion that spoke of infinite despair. It was not always so. Before the church, before the fences, this place, it had another name. A secret name whispered only in fear. He looked around, his gaze sweeping over the neatly tilled rows, the struggling rose bushes Alistair had planted, the sturdy walls of her small cabin. They brought women here. Women who disobeyed. His eyes narrowed. "And yesterday I saw men with measuring lines and more stakes. They plan to desecrate it further, to build quickly before the truth can find its tongue." A cold dread far more chilling than the dawn air began to seep into Margaret, piercing through her initial shock. Disobeyed whom? Their fathers, their husbands, the town council. Ash Talon set his voice flat, each word a dropped stone in a deep well. Women who chose their own paths. Women who loved where they were told they should not. His eyes, deep pools of ancient sorrow, met hers, and in their depths she saw a pain that mirrored her own widow's ache, yet was terrifyingly different, poisoned by a profound, festering injustice. My Celia. She loved me. A white woman and a Lenape warrior. It was a crime in their eyes, an affront to their God, they said. Margaret felt a wave of dizziness, the world tilting on its axis. She had heard whispers, of course, during her years as the preacher's wife. Fragmented conversations, veiled allusions to the town's early, harsher days of a strong house, on the outskirts where difficult women were corrected. Her Alistair, ever the optimist, the believer in present goodness, had always steered her away from such talk, calling it uncharitable, unproductive. He had been a man of progress, of looking forward, not back into the suffocating shadows of the past. He'd even championed new projects, with that same forward-looking spirit. Now Margaret recalled Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth, a leading figure in the Ladies' Aid Society, a woman known for her fervent piety and outward displays of charity. Eleanor had often praised Alistair's vision for the maternity retreat, her voice laced with an almost fervent approval that Margaret had found, even then, a little disquieting. Eleanor had spoken of shielding these unfortunate girls from their own worst impulses. The memory now curdled in Margaret's mind. They called her a witch. Ash continued, his voice, now a low, rhythmic monotone, as if recounting a story learned by rote, a catechism of unending sorrow. Said she had polluted the lineage, bringing shame to her people. They locked her away here on this land. There was a building, then a strong house, hidden by the trees, He gestured vaguely towards the denser woods beyond the willow. They gave her medicine daily, to calm her spirit. They told her to keep her quiet, to prepare her for what Margaret breathed, though a part of her, cold and sick, already knew a horrifying premonition rising like bile in her throat. They were going to take the child. Ash said, his voice breaking, shattering the monotone. Our child. She was pregnant. They called it a cleansing, an abomination to be removed from her and from the world. His gaze flickered back to the freshly disturbed earth near his feet. They would not even let it be born of her body. They spoke of instruments, of stopping its breath before it drew its first. Margaret recoiled, a hand flying to her mouth. The horror of it, a physical assault. The heavy iron poker slipped from her numb fingers, thudding softly, uselessly, onto the damp grass. This quiet piece of land, her refuge from a grieving world, suddenly felt tainted, its soil steeped in an ancient, hidden cruelty, a silent testament to unimaginable barbarity. I tried to save her, Ash, whispered, his gaze returning to the willow, to the violently disturbed earth around its roots. I watched for weeks, planned. I broke in. There was a struggle with the guards, with her weakness. She was so weak from their drugs, from the fear. She did not survive the escape. She died in my arms, right there. He pointed again definitively to the spot beneath the weeping branches. The ground was softer than, untouched by plows like yours. I dug with my knife with my bare hands. All night I laid her there, wrapped in my own shirt, with the morning star to watch over her. Then I ran, became a shadow, a whisper in the wind. They thought I was dead. It was better that way for a time. Margaret stared at him. The story too horrific, too raw to be a mere fabrication. The unadulterated agony etched into every line of his face. The decades of grief carried in the slump of his shoulders was undeniable proof. She thought of the current town council of Mayor Thompson, a man who preached piety and civic duty from the steps of the general store. Every Sunday, Alistair had not been available, his voice resonating with self-importance. She thought of the plans she had overheard Alistair speaking with enthusiasm. Discussions about new developments, progress for their growing community. About a charitable new venture on the outskirts of town. Alistair had even proudly shown her the detailed plans for the maternity retreat, blueprints filled with small, sterile rooms and high walls, which he'd explained were for privacy and quiet contemplation. Why now, she finally managed, her voice barely audible. After all these years, why come back now? Why risk everything? Ash Talon's eyes narrowed, a spark of the legendary warrior igniting within the sorrow-filled husk. They are going to build here. The stakes I saw yesterday, the talk I heard in the settlements beyond the river, they confirm it. A new place for women, a maternity retreat for wayward women. They call it. He spat the words, as if they were poison burning his tongue. For girls who cause trouble. For those who bring shame. The first bulldozer arrives within days. I heard the land must be cleared. They will not even wait for the final vote. They are that certain. Margaret's blood ran cold, the earlier dread crystallizing into icy certainty. She knew of the plan. Alistair himself had been peripherally involved in the initial fundraising years ago, before his health had begun its inexorable decline. He had spoken of it with sincere conviction as a charitable venture, a place of quiet reflection and expert guidance for young women who had strayed, a place to help them find their way back to a righteous, productive path. She had never questioned it, had accepted his word, his earnest belief, as she always did. The wooden stake she'd seen this morning was no random marker. It was the beginning of that end. It is a lie, Ash Talon said, his voice rising with a desperate, fierce urgency that brooked no argument. It is the same as before. The same men or their sons, their grandsons, the same ideas dressed in newer, softer words. They will not call it witchcraft now. They will use words like hysteria, moral weakness, rehabilitation. But it will be the same. They will bury their secrets here again. More daughters, more stolen lives. More forgotten graves to feed the roots of that cursed willow. Margaret looked at the disturbed earth, at the stoic ancient willow, whose branches seemed to droop under the weight of unspeakable history. And then, at the ragged, haunted man before her, a man who had carried a torch of grief and love for decades. A terrible, consuming fire, fueled by a truth that refused to stay buried. Her quiet parcel of land, her carefully cultivated retreat from the harsh realities of the world, was not a sanctuary at all. It was a graveyard, a charnel ground, a place of forgotten atrocities, and now it seemed the stage for their cynical, self-righteous repetition. The stakes in the ground were like nails ready for a coffin. The sun was higher now, its golden light chasing away the last of the dawn chill. But Margaret felt colder than ever before in her life. The stories of the old frontier, the dark, unsettling whispers Alistair had so gently, so firmly discouraged, suddenly felt terribly, undeniably real, their long shadows reaching out from the past to clutch at her present. And she, Margaret Calloway, the preacher's quiet widow, stood squarely in their path. She bent down and picked up the iron poker. But this time, its weight in her hand felt different. It was not for defense against this man. It was a tool, or perhaps a weapon against something far larger, far more insidious. "Show me," she said, her voice quiet, but imbued with a new steely firmness that surprised even herself. "Show me exactly where you laid her to rest." Ash Talon looked at her, a flicker of profound surprise crossing his ravaged features, then a dawning, fragile ember of hope in his weary eyes. He nodded slowly, a single solemn movement, and turned back to the willow, to the place where his world had ended, and where Margaret's, in a terrifying and profound way, was about to be irrevocably altered. He pointed to a specific spot slightly to the right of where he had initially been digging, an area less disturbed by her recent planting. The earth remembers, even if men forget, especially men like them. Margaret took a deep, shuddering breath. The garden hoe and spade leaned against the cabin wall, implements of life and growth. Now they would become tools of exhumation, of unearthing a buried nightmare. "Wait here," she told him, and walked with a newfound grim purpose to fetch them. The sun climbed higher, casting long, accusing shadows that twisted and writhed like the secrets this accursed land held. As she returned, spade in hand, she noticed the wildflowers that grew in a profusion of color around the base of the willow, a vibrant carpet of blues, yellows, and reds. They were beautiful, a splash of defiant life against the somber backdrop. Or perhaps she thought with a visceral shiver that had nothing to do with the morning air. A beautiful, unknowing shroud, nourished by unimaginable sorrow. They began to dig Ash with his bare, calloused hands, occasionally using a sharpened stick he procured Margaret with a spade, its sharp edge biting into the resistant soil. The work was slow, arduous. Margaret, though accustomed to the demands of her garden, was not used to such heavy, relentless labor. But a strange, fierce energy flowed through her. A sense of terrible imperative, a righteous anger she hadn't known she possessed. Ash worked with a focused, almost ritualistic intensity. His earlier frenzy replaced by a grim, sorrowful determination. They said little, the silence punctuated only by the harsh scrape of the spade against stone and root, the tearing of unseen things, and their own ragged, increasingly labored breaths. Hours seemed to pass, each one an eternity. The sun beat down on them mercilessly, and sweat stung Margaret's eyes, blurring her vision. Her muscles screamed in protest, her hands unused to such brutality blistered and bled, but the image of Celia, the unknown woman who had loved a forbidden man and carried his child into a hell of human making, pushed her onward. The thought of Alistair, her upright, moral Alistair, and his connection, however unwitting, she desperately wanted to believe, to the funding of this new, euphemistically named retreat, gnawed at her. She recalled a specific evening Alistair by the fire, his face earnest, saying, "Margaret, this retreat will be a true service." Mayor Thompson has assured me every detail is considered for the girl's moral and spiritual uplift. It's vital work. His conviction had been absolute. Had it been built on lies or willful blindness? She pushed the agonizing thought away, unable to bear its weight, just yet focusing on the rhythm of the dig-thrust, lift-toss. Then the spade struck something that was not stone, not root. A dull, hollow thud. Ash froze his head, bowed his breath, catching in a ragged gasp. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden suffocating silence. Carefully, meticulously, she scraped away the surrounding soil with the edge of the spade, then with her own trembling fingers. Old rotting wood planks, crudely joined, almost mulch in places. Ash knelt his hands, shaking violently as he brushed away the last vestiges of clinging earth. He uncovered the pitiful remnants of what looked like a roughly made box. Much of it decayed and collapsed inward under the immense pressure of time and forgetting, and beneath it, nestled within the decaying wood and stained earth, something else, bones, small, achingly delicate. Not the sturdy frame of an adult woman. Margaret gasped, stumbling back a step, a choked sound escaping her lips. Ash, what is this? This cannot be. Celia. The delicate bones were unmistakably those of an infant or a fetus, very near term. An almost unbearable wave of nausea swept over her. He did not look up. His voice, when it came, was so choked with unshed tears, it was almost unrecognizable. I could not bury her alone. Her spirit would be lost wandering. I found a small crate. From the old stores they kept at the Strong House. It was all I had. He reached into the shallow depression, his fingers stained with earth and sorrow, tracing the outline of something incredibly fragile. Horrifyingly small. I put the child with her. What was left of the child, they had already harmed it, tried to remove it before she died in my arms. It was still warm. But so still he choked back a sob that seemed to tear from the depths of his soul. They called it a necessary extraction, savages. The full, unadulterated horror of it washed over Margaret in a suffocating, silent wave. This was not just one grave, one tragedy. It was a desecration, compounded an atrocity, layered upon atrocity. A mother and her unborn, or perhaps brutally newborn child, victims of a calculated, self-righteous cruelty that defied comprehension. She sank to her knees beside him, the spade falling from her nerveless grasp, clattering against a stone. Tears, hot and fierce, welled in her eyes, tears of sorrow, of incandescent rage, of a profound, unutterable shame for the humanity that could perpetrate such acts and then call it God's will. Ash Talon finally looked up, his face a mask of ancient, unyielding grief, a roadmap of suffering etched by decades of solitary mourning. Now you see, he said softly, his voice resonating with the terrible weight of his knowledge. Now you understand what this land truly holds. Margaret nodded, speechless, the air thick with unspoken horrors. The wildflowers blooming so gaily nearby suddenly seemed like a cruel, grotesque mockery. Their vibrant beauty, a deceptive lie, painted over an unspeakable, festering truth. How many more secrets did this cursed ground hold? How many other lives had been stolen and forgotten, their stories buried beneath the indifferent passage of seasons, their silent screams absorbed by the roots of the weeping willow? This new retreat. Margaret finally said, her voice hoarse, raw, the one they plan. The stakes I saw this morning. They intend to start clearing the land within 2 days. The council vote is merely a formality, Ash. Thompson means to act fast before any opposition can form. She felt a desperate urgency. We have to stop them. A flicker of the old warrior spirit, the unquenchable fire of defiance, returned to Ash's eyes. They are powerful, respected men. Mayor Thompson, the council, he shook his head. Who will believe us? A grieving preacher's widow, suddenly questioning her sainted husband's legacy, and a ghost from a bloody past they all wished to forget. His gaze turned inward, and Margaret saw a flicker of deep self-doubt. Perhaps it is my grief alone making shadows into monsters. Your grief is real, Ash. What we found here is real, Margaret said, gripping his arm, surprised by her own vehemence. I do not know how, but we cannot let this happen again. Celia deserves more than this. Her child deserves more. And if there are others... She trailed off, the chilling implication hanging heavy and fetid in the humid air between them. They sat there for a long time, two solitary figures beside the shallow makeshift grave, united by a truth that had lain dormant, festering for decades. The sun reached its zenith, beating down on the open wound in the earth, and then began its slow, inexorable descent, painting the western sky in bruised hues of orange and purple. The willow's branches swayed gently in the evening breeze, its leaves whispering secrets to the indifferent wind, secrets that Margaret was now terrifyingly beginning to understand. As twilight deepened, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mimic tortured forms, Margaret made a decision, a clear, cold resolve hardening within her. We need to rest, she said, her voice gaining a practical edge. And then we need to think. There must be a way. There has to be. She looked at Ash, truly looked at him. Not as a fearsome legend or a ragged, desperate intruder, but as a man who had suffered an unbearable, unimaginable loss, and had carried its crushing burden with a quiet, unwavering dignity. You can stay in the shed. It's dry. I have blankets and some food. Ash hesitated, his dark eyes searching hers. You would offer shelter to me, to Ash Talon. After all this has brought to your door, you are Celia's husband, Margaret said simply, the truth of it, resonating with an unexpected clarity. And you are telling a truth that needs to be heard, a truth this town has tried to bury for too long. That night, Margaret lay in her lonely bed, but sleep was a distant, unattainable shore. The cabin, once her sanctuary, her cocoon of quiet grief, now felt like a sentinel's exposed post on the bleeding edge of a forgotten battlefield. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside her window, every hoot of a distant owl seemed to echo with the whispers of the unquiet dead. She thought of Alistair, his earnest sermons on compassion and righteousness, his unwavering belief in the inherent goodness of their community. Had he been blind? Or had he, in his eagerness for progress, for peace, for the esteem of men like Mayor Thompson, chosen not to see the rot beneath the polished surface? The question tormented her, a hook in her soul. He had been a good man. She fiercely wanted to believe a kind man. But kindness without vigilance, without the courage to confront uncomfortable, damning truths, what was its true worth? Was it anything more than polite cowardice? She recalled Eleanor Ainsworth praising Alistair. Such a strong moral compass, Reverend Calloway. Unlike some who came before, stirring up old grievances. The memory was now laced with venom. The next morning, Margaret found Ash already awake, a gaunt silhouette standing by the willow tree, his gaze fixed on the disturbed earth where Celia and their child lay. He had washed his face and hands in the basin of water she had left out for him. And though his clothes were still ragged, there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a quiet, steely resolve that mirrored her own growing determination. They used to say the wildflowers grew thickest, where the ground was richest, where blood had been spilled and soaked deep. Ash said, his voice low resonant. Here they grow like a carpet of many colors. He gestured not just to the area immediately around Celia's reclaimed grave, but to a wider expanse beneath the willow's weeping canopy, and stretching towards the dark edge of the woods. Celia loved wildflowers. She knew all their names, their medicines. She once showed me a small, almost invisible flower here by this willow that she said eased fear. I wonder if she found any before they... His voice trailed off. A chilling, sickening thought struck Margaret, an intuition so strong it felt like a ghostly hand gripping her arm. Ash, do you think? Could there be other graves? His eyes, ancient with sorrow, met hers, somber and deeply knowing. This was a place of secrets for a long time. Before your church, before the surveyors and their stakes, Celia was not the first woman to anger the council, to defy their iron will. Nor, I gravely think, was she the last they brought to the strong house, hidden in those trees. The potential enormity of it, the scale of the concealed depravity, threatened to overwhelm her. One grave was a tragedy that cried out for justice. A field of them was an atrocity that beggared belief, a crime against God and humanity that would stain this land forever. "We have to look," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet laced with an unshakable conviction. "We have to know the full truth." They spent the next several days in a grim, painstaking, increasingly horrifying search. It began with the area immediately around the willow. Margaret used the spade, Ash's hands, or a sharpened stick he'd fashioned, probing the earth gently, respectfully, always aware of what or who might lie inches beneath. It was slow, heart-wrenching, emotionally flaying work, the wildflowers, so vibrant and cheerful in their innocent beauty, now seemed to mock them and their tenacious roots. She imagined entangled with the darkness, beneath, drawing sustenance from forgotten bones. The first discovery after Celia's came 2 days later, not far from the willow's drip line, in a patch of soil that seemed unusually sunken. A cluster of smaller bones, so fragile they crumbled at the slightest touch, too delicate to be anything but those of an infant, or perhaps a very young child. There were no remnants of a coffin. No token, just the bones nestled in the dark earth, as if they had been laid there with a sorrowful tenderness, or perhaps a callous, damning haste. Margaret felt a fresh wave of visceral sickness, her stomach churning. Who was this child, whose innocent hopes and fledgling dreams had been extinguished here, unmourned and recorded? Ash Talon said nothing, but his face grew harder, stonier, the lines of grief deepening until they looked like cracks in granite. He carefully, reverently recovered the remains, marking the spot with a small, precise cairn of stones they'd unearthed. They found another, and then another. Not always complete skeletons, often just fragments shielded and preserved by the dense clay soil. Some were clearly adults, indicated by the size and thickness of a recovered femur or piece of skull. Others were distressingly, horrifyingly small. Each discovery was like a fresh wound inflicted upon Margaret's soul, a silent, damning testament to the calculated, systematic cruelty that had flourished in this seemingly tranquil, sanctified place. Margaret began to keep a tally in her mind, a grim secret ledger, each count a silent accusation against the men who had preached piety while practicing barbarity. She learned from Ash that surveyors had been seen on the edge of her property a few days before his arrival, their sighting acting as the final spur for his desperate return. The deadline for the new construction was, he'd heard, terrifyingly close. Thompson aimed to have machinery on site within 72 hours. She learned more about Ash during those sun-scorched days and cool, haunted nights, more about his life with Celia, a bond that transcended culture and prejudice. He spoke of her courage, her infectious laughter that could banish shadows, her quiet defiance of the narrow, suffocating expectations placed upon women in that era. She once stitched a sun symbol lenape way into the hem of a prayer shawl she was forced to make for the church sewing circle. He recounted, a faint smile ghosting his lips. A tiny rebellion only she and I understood. They called it decorative stitching. His love for her, undimmed by decades of relentless sorrow and bitter solitude, was a palpable force, a burning ember that had somehow survived the desolate wasteland of his life. Margaret, in turn, found herself speaking of Alistair, of her quiet, circumscribed life as a preacher's wife, of her own unacknowledged loneliness that had existed even before his death. She confessed her growing, agonizing unease about her husband's fervent involvement with the maternity retreat project, the one Mayor Thompson now championed with such unctuous fervor. He believed in progress, in improving the community, in what he called Christian outreach. She said, her voice laced with a confusion and a dawning horror she could no longer hide. He often spoke of the town's desperate need for a place to guide young women, to offer them support and redemption. If they found themselves in unfortunate, compromising circumstances, Ash listened patiently, his dark eyes deep with an ancient wisdom, born of suffering largely unreadable. Sometimes he said slowly, his voice raspy from disuse and emotion, progress is just a new name for old cruelties, and support can look very much like a cage if you are the one they wish to confine and silence. Like the medicines they gave Celia to calm her spirit, which only stole her strength. His words resonated with a terrible, chilling clarity within Margaret. She remembered countless conversations within the Ladies' Aid Society, hushed, judgmental discussions led by Eleanor Ainsworth about girls who were too wild, willful, or had made unfortunate choices that shamed their families. There was always an undercurrent of moral superiority, of a desperate desire to control, to discipline, to bring these errant souls back into the narrow fold, often through measures that felt far more punitive than compassionate. More about preserving appearances than offering genuine succor. One sweltering afternoon, as they worked near a patch of particularly vibrant Indian paintbrush, its fiery colors like spilled blood on the parched earth, Margaret's spade struck something metallic, small and resistant. It was a locket tarnished almost black with age and neglect, heart-shaped, intricately engraved with the initial E. With trembling fingers, she forced open the stiff clasp. Inside, nestled against a circle of faded, disintegrating velvet, was a miniature, exquisitely painted portrait of a young woman with a cascade of fiery red hair and a defiant, almost mischievous sparkle. In her arresting green eyes, Alara, Ash murmured, peering over her shoulder, his breath catching. Her name was Alara. She was a healer, knew the old ways. With herbs helped many women, both white and Lenape. Some said she was a friend to my people. They accused her of consorting with spirits of witchcraft, of leading other young women astray from the path of righteousness. He touched the locket gently with a soil-stained fingertip. She disappeared about a year before. They took Celia. Vanished without a trace. They said Celia wept for her. Margaret closed her eyes, and the image of the vibrant, flame-haired young woman seared into her mind. Ilara Celia, and the nameless forgotten others. The wildflowers, their colors now unbearably vivid, seemed to whisper their names, their stolen, truncated stories carried on the hot, dry wind. The tally grew with each passing day. By the end of a brutal, emotionally shattering week, they had identified more than a dozen potential grave sites. Shallow, telltale depressions in the earth, subtle changes in soil composition that only Ash's experienced eye could detect, or in a few horrifying, undeniable instances, the actual visible presence of human remains unearthed by rain or the burrowing of animals. Her garden, her cherished place of peace and sustenance, was a boneyard, a mass grave. The realization was a physical sickness that settled deep in her gut one evening as they sat by her small crackling fire. The day's grim discoveries weighing heavily upon their exhausted shoulders, Margaret spoke, her voice low but resolute. "We need proof, irrefutable proof, that will make them listen. Proof they cannot deny or bury deeper." She felt a sense of urgency. Ash had reported that the surveying team was due back any day to finalize measurements before the bulldozers arrived, now surely less than 2 days away. "We have only until the council meeting. After that, Thompson has vowed to start preliminary site preparation. Vote or no vote, he's daring anyone to stop him." Ash nodded, his gaze lost in the flickering flames. "The locket is something, the bones. If someone with authority, someone they respect, would only look." He paused, a flicker of old pain in his eyes. "There was a doctor in town, and then old Doc Abernathy. He was a kind man, I heard. but he was afraid of the counsel of their power. He tended to Celia once, when they first brought her here before they barred him. He argued against the medicines they forced upon her. But they silenced him, threatened his practice, even whispered that he too was becoming soft on native sympathizers. Is he still alive? Margaret asked, a fragile tendril of hope unfurling within her. Ash shook his head, the hope withering. Died many years ago. His son Thomas Abernathy took over his practice. I do not know the son. He would have been but a boy. Then Margaret did. Dr. Thomas Abernathy was a respected, if somewhat aloof man in town, known for his quiet competence and his reserved, almost taciturn demeanor. He was younger than Alistair had been, but they had served on a few town committees together. He seemed fair-minded, meticulous, if perhaps overly cautious, and certainly not one to challenge the established order without compelling cause. He can be prickly, Margaret murmured, recalling a time he had coolly dismissed a suggestion from Alistair as insufficiently evidenced. But his integrity was generally unquestioned. Before Margaret could pursue this, a different kind of conversation intervened. The next morning, Eleanor Ainsworth paid an unexpected visit. Her usual air of serene piety was strained. "Margaret, dear," she began, accepting a cup of tea. Margaret reluctantly offered. "There are whispers about you and that man you are harboring. People are concerned. They say you are not yourself since Alistair's passing." Margaret's spine stiffened. "I am myself more than ever, Eleanor, and Ash Talon is helping me uncover a terrible truth about this land." Eleanor's smile faltered. "Truth, my dear. Sometimes old stories are best left undisturbed for the good of the community. For Alistair's good name, this maternity retreat Mayor Thompson is championing. It is a fine project, a Christian endeavor. Alistair believed in it so fervently. You wouldn't want to tarnish his vision with unsubstantiated claims from a troubled native, would you?" Her eyes held a curious mixture of concern and warning. "And if the claims are substantiated, Eleanor, if Alistair's vision was built on a lie on buried bones," Margaret's voice was quiet but cold. Eleanor placed her teacup down with a trembling hand. "Some things are better not known, Margaret, for peace, for progress." Her gaze flickered away. "My own family has prospered in this town by understanding that there are certain arrangements that have ensured stability for generations. Councilman Davies, his family has long benefited from orderly progress. Stirring up the past benefits no one." She left soon after her attempt at gentle persuasion, having failed, leaving Margaret with an even deeper sense of unease about the town's interwoven secrets. The following day, after a night filled with unsettling dreams of whispers and disturbed earth, Margaret rode into town on her old mare, her heart a tight, painful knot of apprehension and dread. The encounter with Eleanor had steeled her resolve, but also heightened her awareness of the entrenched opposition. The settlement, which Alistair had always proudly called our burgeoning community, a beacon of civility on the frontier, now felt different to her. Its familiar dusty streets and clapboard buildings overlaid with a sinister, suffocating veneer. The smiles of the townsfolk she passed seemed strained, their polite pleasantries hollow, even accusing. Or perhaps she thought with a sinking heart it was she who had changed her eyes, now open to a darkness she could no longer ignore. She saw two burly men, strangers to her, watching her from the shadowed porch of the saloon. Thompson's men, no doubt. She found Dr. Thomas Abernathy in his surgery. A neat, surprisingly orderly room, smelling faintly of carbolic acid, dried herbs, and old paper. He was a man of medium height, with his father's kind, intelligent eyes, but a more serious, unyielding set to his mouth. He looked up from his ledgers, a hint of polite surprise in his expression. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice even and professional. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I trust you are well. I was so sorry to hear of Alistair's passing. A great loss to us all. I am..." Managing doctor, thank you. Margaret replied, forcing a calmness she was far from feeling into her voice. But I have come on a matter of extreme gravity, a matter concerning my land, Alistair's parsonage land, and things that happened there many, many years ago. Horrific things. Things that Mayor Thompson's plans for the new retreat threatened to repeat or permanently conceal. She told him then, her voice low and steady, despite the frantic hammering of her pulse recounting Ash Talon's harrowing story. The chilling discovery of Celia's violated remains and those of her child, and the subsequent soul-destroying unearthing of other numerous suspected graves. She showed him Ilara's locket, its tarnished silver, a stark contrast to the vibrant life captured in the miniature portrait. Dr. Abernathy listened intently, his initial professional composure slowly giving way to an expression of profound somberness, then shock, and finally a dawning horror. He asked few questions, mainly clarifying details of location and time, but his sharp, perceptive eyes never left hers assessing, weighing. When she had finished, the silence in the small surgery was heavy, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Dr. Abernathy rose and walked to his window, his back to her, looking out at the dusty main street, at the facade of civic order. My father, he said finally, his voice subdued, almost a whisper. He never spoke openly to me of such specific atrocities. I was too young, perhaps. But there were notes, journals. He was a meticulous, almost obsessive record keeper. He turned back to Margaret, his face pale but resolute. He wrote often of his concerns of women brought to a secluded property out towards the old Willow Creek for treatment or extended rest. He suspected gross mistreatment, unrecorded deaths, even murder. But he had no concrete proof, only suspicions, and the terrified whispered rumors of a few brave souls. And the town council at the time, led by men whose names are still invoked with reverence by some. They were formidable men who believed they were building a righteous, God-fearing community, and who would tolerate no dissent, no questioning of their divine mandate. He paused, his gaze distant, troubled. He also wrote of difficult choices, of pressures. His voice dropped. There was one entry heavily ciphered that I only recently decoded. It implied that he was coerced into witnessing a procedure he abhorred to verify its necessity, as they put it, for a woman who later vanished. He wrote of her screams of the guards restraining him. He tried to intervene. They threatened to implicate him as an accomplice, to destroy his family, his ability to help anyone else. He wrote, I became a coward that day to preserve a sliver of usefulness. May God forgive me for what I saw and did not stop. It seems this burden haunted him till his death. This unexpected confession from Abernathy about his own father, not just a hero, but a compromised man, struck Margaret deeply. It made Thomas's own involvement feel even weightier. He mentioned a woman named Celia Abernathy, continued, his voice gaining a harder edge, as if channeling his father's old outrage, who had, in his words, defied convention by marrying a Lenape man. He was called to attend her shortly after her confinement. He noted she was heavily sedated, incoherent, and that there were hushed, chilling plans for a surgical procedure to remove what they termed the unholy fruit of her womb. A procedure he found morally, medically, and humanly repugnant. His gaze, now filled with a grim understanding and a new personal fire, met Margaret's. He was barred from seeing her again. Shortly thereafter, his concerns dismissed as oversensitivity. Margaret felt a surge of chilling validation mixed with a renewed, almost frantic sense of urgency. The surveyor's stakes on her land felt like countdown markers to oblivion. Doctor, they are planning to build on that very land again. Immediately, Mayor Thompson is championing it, a maternity retreat. Ash Talon believes it is a direct continuation of the same barbaric program under a different, more palatable name. We only have until the council meeting tomorrow afternoon. Thompson aims for the vote to be the first order of business, Dr. Abernathy ran a hand through his thinning hair, a gesture of profound agitation. Mayor Thompson is spearheading that project with almost religious zeal. He speaks of it as a beacon of Christian charity and progressive care for unfortunate wayward women. He sighed a sound of deep weariness. My father also wrote of Aleister Calloway's immediate predecessor at the church, a Reverend Hawthorne. He noted that Hawthorne was a vociferous supporter of the council's more extreme efforts to maintain moral purity and racial hygiene in the burgeoning community. Hawthorne, it seems, was a fire and brimstone ideologue. Margaret felt an icy chill slither down her spine. Aleister's predecessor, the man whose legacy Aleister had inherited. Had Aleister known of this tainted legacy when he took up his post, when he so enthusiastically solicited funds for this new Thompson-led retreat on that specific parcel of land, the questions like vultures continued to circle closer and closer. What Ash Talon describes. What you have found, Mrs. Calloway. It is monstrous beyond contemplation. Dr. Abernathy said, his voice tight with controlled fury. And if it is true, if your land is indeed a graveyard, a killing field, we cannot allow it to be desecrated further by bulldozers and new foundations, and we certainly cannot under any circumstances allow such evil practices to resume, no matter how cleverly disguised. He looked at Margaret with a newfound profound respect. You have taken an enormous personal risk, Mrs. Calloway, by bringing this to me, and by sheltering Ash Talon. He is still a wanted man in some quarters, however unjustly. It is the right thing to do, Dr. Margaret said simply, the words feeling inadequate to the enormity of the situation. It is the only thing to do, indeed. Dr. Abernathy nodded, his jaw set. I will need to see this for myself, immediately. And I will need to consult my father's journals more thoroughly tonight. They are extensive and often cryptically written to protect identities. He hesitated, a shadow of caution crossing his face. We must be exceedingly careful, Mayor Thompson and his allies, particularly men like Councilman Davies, whose family has owned the land bordering yours for generations and stands to profit from the retreat's access road, are powerful and ruthless. They will not take kindly to such accusations. They will seek to destroy us. My father wrote of Davies' grandfather as a wolf in sheep's clothing who profited from misery. The apple does not fall far from the tree, I fear. That evening, just after dusk, a furtive knock came at Margaret's cabin door. It was Dr. Abernathy, his face grim, accompanied by a sturdy, quiet young man named Peter, who had apprenticed with him for several years, and whom Abernathy vouched for as utterly discreet and loyal. Margaret led them through the darkening garden to the ancient willow tree, where Ash Talon stood waiting, a silent, watchful sentinel in the encroaching gloom. He had insisted on being present, his eyes burning with a protective fire over Celia's resting place. With a heavy heart and grim determination, Margaret and Ash showed them Celia's reclaimed resting place, and then the other sites they had meticulously marked with small cairns of stones. Dr. Abernathy examined each one with a practiced clinical eye, his face growing increasingly pale and grave. In the flickering light of the lantern Peter held aloft, he knelt by one of the shallower depressions where they suspected an infant lay, carefully probing the disturbed soil with a thin metal rod. He worked in intense, focused silence for some time. Peter shielding the lantern's flame from the rising night breeze, Ash stood like a statue. His arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but radiating a tense energy. Finally, Dr. Abernathy rose, brushing dirt from his knees, his face ashen in the flickering lamplight. There are human remains here, he said, his voice quiet but firm, utterly devoid of doubt. Multiple individuals, I am certain. The soil composition, the shallow depth of burial in several locations, the type of decay. It is entirely consistent with clandestine, hurried interments over a prolonged period. He looked directly at Ash Talon, then at Margaret, his gaze holding a mixture of horror and respect. What you have told me, what you have shown me, I believe it to be unequivocally true. My God, I believe it. A wave of profound relief washed over Margaret, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. Sphisom. She leaned against the rough bark of the willow for support. Ash Talon merely nodded, a single slow, solemn movement. But she saw the easing of a terrible decades-long tension in his shoulders, as if a crushing physical weight had been fractionally lifted. My father's journals. Abernathy continued, his voice strained. They corroborate significant parts of your story, Ash Talon, and yours, Mrs. Calloway. He wrote in detail of women who were brought to a holding house or strong room on this very tract of land. He listed names when he could learn them and approximate dates. Celia's name is among them, with a chilling entry about her unfortunate condition and the council's drastic solution. He pulled a small, worn, leather-bound notebook from his medical bag. So is an Alara, a midwife and herbalist accused of witchcraft and corrupting influence. My father even made rough sketches of the property, as it was then, noting the probable location of the old stronghouse, which seems to be deeper in those woods. He pointed towards the dense tree line and an area he designated on his crude map only as the quiet field. He looked towards the expanse beneath and beyond the willow, where they had found the most disturbances. I believe this is that field. He suspected many were buried there. The disparate, horrifying pieces were falling into place, forming a mosaic of calculated cruelty, ideological fervor, and systematic deception that spanned decades. What do we do now? Margaret asked, her voice trembling slightly, the sheer scale of the conspiracy and the danger they faced pressing down on her. Thompson is pushing for the final vote on the retreat construction at tomorrow afternoon's council meeting. That's less than 24 hours, and he's threatened to start work regardless. We need to bring this to light to the entire town. Abernathy said, his gaze hardening into one of steely resolve. But we must be strategic, unassailable. Mayor Thompson will try to discredit us, to silence us, to paint you, Ash Talon, as a vengeful savage, and you, Mrs. Calloway, as a hysterical widow. He has a great deal invested in this maternity retreat, both financially through undeclared partnerships with the suppliers, I suspect, and certainly in terms of his public reputation as a benevolent leader. The full council meets tomorrow. Peter Abernathy's young assistant spoke, his voice surprisingly steady and clear. 1 p.m. They will be discussing the final approval for the retreat's construction contract and the immediate breaking of ground. Then we have less than a day to stop a monster from being born again. Abernathy said, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light. We need more than just your testimonies, Mrs. Calloway, and yours, Ash Talon, powerful though they are. We need evidence that the entire town council, every last member, cannot ignore, dismiss, or sweep under their plush rug. We need to make the silent dead speak so loudly that even the deafest among them will hear. He proposed a bold, risky plan. He and Peter, working through the remaining hours of darkness with Margaret and Ash, would conduct a more thorough, albeit still respectful and limited examination of a few key sites. They would document everything, meticulously take careful notes, measure depths, and try to recover any further artifacts that could help identify the victims or corroborate the timeline established by his father's journals. These, along with key journal pages and a map, would be placed in a locked box. He, meanwhile, would spend the early morning hours cross-referencing his father's journals with old town records, birth records, death records, or lack thereof, council minutes, church registries, searching for patterns for names of women who had disappeared without explanation, whose stories had been deliberately erased. They had to have something undeniable for the 1 p.m. meeting. The next few hours were a blur of intense, nerve-wracking, somber activity. Under Abernathy's meticulous guidance, they carefully excavated small sections of two of the most promising grave sites, working by lantern light, every shadow seeming to conceal a watching enemy. They found more bones. Pathetically small, unmistakably infant. Tragically adult, some bearing marks that Abernathy grimly noted could be consistent with violent trauma. They found fragments of rotted clothing, a single child's shoe, a small, crudely carved wooden bird that Ash's face a mask of sorrow, identified as similar to simple toys. Lenape children played with, perhaps a gift from Celia to her unborn child, or from another mother to another lost child. Each discovery was handled with profound reverence. Each item placed carefully into the evidence box. A poignant, heartbreaking reminder of a life brutally stolen, a future annihilated. Margaret found herself drawing an unexpected strength from Ash Talon. His quiet, unwavering dignity, his unshakable commitment to honoring Celia's memory, and finding justice for all the forgotten souls was a powerful anchor in the storm of emotions that threatened to engulf her. She, in turn, offered him a quiet companionship, a shared sense of righteous purpose that he had been cruelly denied for so long. An unlikely, improbable alliance forged in shared grief and a burning thirst for justice that transcended their disparate worlds. As pre-dawn light began to streak the sky, Abernathy locked the gathered evidence, the locket, the bird, the shoe scraps of fabric, and his father's most damning journal pages, into a sturdy wooden medical case. I will take this to my surgery for safekeeping. We meet at the Mercantile Steps at 1:45. The hours leading up to the council meeting were fraught with new tension, just after Abernathy and Peter departed with the evidence box. And as Ash returned to the relative cover of the shed, a heavy rock crashed through Margaret's small kitchen window, shattering glass across the floor. Wrapped around it was a piece of paper, identical to the type used for council notices, with a crudely scrawled message, "Widow. Last warning, some secrets, stay buried, or you join them. The land will be cleared tonight." Ash, appearing instantly, his eyes blazing, found heavy boot prints leading away towards the road. Thompson wasn't just threatening. He was accelerating his timeline. The rock was clearly meant for intimidation, perhaps even to provoke a response that could be twisted against them. Abernathy, meanwhile, after a few precious hours barricaded in his study with old town ledgers, confirmed a profoundly disturbing pattern over a period of roughly 20 years, corresponding to the time the zealous Reverend Hawthorne led the church. And the town council was dominated by a cabal of self-styled moral guardians, an unusually high number of young women, particularly those who were unmarried, recently widowed, native allied, or had reputations for being independent-minded or troublesomely outspoken, had either vanished from public record entirely, were noted as having left town for their health without forwarding addresses, or were recorded as dying from vague, unspecified female complaints. Many of these disappearances and sudden deaths coincided ominously with cryptic entries in old Doc Abernathy's journals about women being taken often forcibly to the secluded property for moral and spiritual correction. The evidence was mounting overwhelmingly compelling when viewed as a whole painting, a chilling, undeniable picture of a systematic clandestine operation designed to control silence and ultimately eliminate women who did not conform to the town's narrow patriarchal dictates. Margaret, emboldened by the tangible threat, and the ticking clock, also confronted her own more recent past. With trembling hands and a heart filled with dread, she searched through Alastair's meticulously organized papers. She found the ledgers detailing church finances, and there it was stark and undeniable. A significant donation made 5 years prior by an anonymous benefactor through the church to a fund specifically earmarked for the Thompson Maternity Retreat Initiative. Alastair had even penned a lengthy, passionate letter of support for the project, praising its noble aims to provide a haven for troubled young women, guiding them towards redemption and responsible Christian womanhood. But then, tucked inside the back of the same ledger, she found something else, something that made her blood run cold. A thin, brittle letter, yellowed with age, addressed to Alastair, from his predecessor, the Reverend Hawthorne, written shortly after Alastair had accepted the parsonage. Most of it was mundane advice about the congregation and the church building. But one paragraph leaped out at her. Regarding the parsonage land itself, particularly the wooded plot westward towards the old willow, you may hear certain regrettable whispers from time to time. Old wives' tales best ignored, for the peace of the community. Our forebears faced difficult challenges in forging this town from the wilderness, and sometimes firm, decisive action was necessary to preserve moral order and the sanctity of our settlement. It is a chapter best left closed, its details unproductive to our current, more enlightened endeavors. Focus on the future. My son, as our new maternity retreat so admirably aims to do, some soil is best left unturned. Reading Hawthorne's chillingly euphemistic words and Alistair's subsequent glowing endorsement of the retreat on that very land, Margaret felt a profound, sickening sorrow, a betrayal that cut deeper than her grief. Alistair had not been a monster, perhaps, but he had been, she now realized with horrifying clarity, a man blinded by his own good intentions, by a societal narrative that equated control with care and silence with peace. Or worse, he had seen a glimpse of the darkness. Hawthorne had practically handed it to him, and chosen to look away to prioritize progress, and is standing over a potentially ruinous truth. He had been a willing cog in a machine, a well-meaning participant in a system that had, in its earlier, more brutal incarnation, committed unspeakable, unforgivable acts. Her complicity until now had been one of naive trust and unquestioning silence. That silence, she vowed with every fiber of her being, was now definitively over. The memory of the rock through her window, the fresh shards of glass still on her floors, only hardened her resolve. Moments before she was to leave for town, Peter Abernathy's assistant arrived at her door, breathless and pale. Mrs. Calloway Thompson's men, they were waiting for the doctor near his surgery. They tried to take the evidence box. The doctor sent me ahead to warn you. He told me to tell you to proceed to the council to speak. He's trying to draw them off, lead them away from the box if he can. But he might be delayed or worse. Peter's voice shook. He said, "The truth must be spoken, even if only one voice remains to speak it." The threat was no longer abstract. It was immediate, violent. Margaret's blood ran cold. Ash, emerging from the shed, his face grim, simply said, "We go now. They will not silence all of us." On the morning of the town council meeting, the air was thick with an oppressive, expectant humidity. Margaret dressed carefully in her plainest, darkest dress, the closest thing she owned to armor. Ash Talon cleaned and wearing a borrowed shirt and trousers from Alistair's old trunk, that while ill-fitting lent him an air of quiet. If somber respectability stood beside her, his face an impassive mask that concealed the turmoil within, they walked to town together. Peter a nervous but determined shadow a few paces behind. They saw Dr. Abernathy at the mercantile steps, his coat torn at the shoulder, a livid bruise blooming on his cheekbone, but his eyes resolute. The locked wooden box was clutched tightly in his hand. They were persuasive, Abernathy said dryly, touching his bruised cheek, but ultimately unsuccessful. The box is secure. For now. His gaze hardened. It seems Mayor Thompson is more desperate than I anticipated. The council chamber located above the mercantile was already crowded, a restless murmur filling the room. Mayor Thompson, a portly, florid-faced man, with an air of unshakable self-importance and a fresh carnation in his lapel, beamed from his prominent seat at the head of the long oak table. He was flanked by several of his key allies, including the stern-faced Councilman Davies. Several rough-looking men, and the same ones Margaret had seen earlier and who Abernathy confirmed were his assailants, stood near the back. Their arms crossed their eyes, watchful and cold. Thompson's enforcers clearly ready for trouble, a sanctuary of healing and hope, a shining beacon of our community's compassion and foresight. Mayor Thompson was declaiming, his voice booming with counterfeit benevolence. A testament to our progressive ideals, a place where unfortunate girls, those who have perhaps in their tender innocence strayed from the path of virtue, can be gently guided back, their delicate sensibilities protected from harsh judgment, where new life can be nurtured in a wholesome Christian environment, securing the future moral fabric of our town. I therefore call for an immediate vote to commence this vital work this very day. He banged his gavel, all in favor. Hands began to rise, Thompson's allies leading the way. Dr. Abernathy cleared his throat, and the sound unexpectedly loud, halting the vote. He stepped forward, Peter flanking him on one side, Margaret and Ash moving to the other, a small determined island in a hostile sea. Mr. Mayor, members of the esteemed council, if I may have a word on this particular matter before that vote is irrevocably cast. Mayor Thompson looked momentarily surprised and then visibly annoyed, his practiced smile tightening into a snarl. His eyes flickered to the thugs at the back, Dr. Abernathy. Now is hardly the time. We always value your medical opinion, of course. Though I believe the overwhelming benefits of this vital project are quite self-evident to all clear-thinking, God-fearing individuals. A ripple of sycophantic laughter came from his allies. Perhaps not all aspects of this land's history nor its suitability for such a venture are as evident as you presume, mister. Mayor Abernathy said, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable steely authority that cut through the room's murmur. He proceeded to lay out their horrifying findings, speaking clearly, methodically, his words precise and devastating. He described the discovery of the numerous unmarked graves on Margaret Calloway's land, the very land designated and already surveyed for the new retreat. He presented his father's journals as meticulously kept contemporaneous corroborating evidence. Reading carefully selected chilling excerpts that spoke of the holding house, the quiet field, and the names of women who had disappeared there, their fates unrecorded. He mentioned the coerced witnessing the necessary extraction, making his father's shame and lifelong guilt palpable. He unfurled a larger, newly drawn map, showing his father's sketches of the quiet field, overlaid with the surveyor's recent markings for the retreat. A perfect, horrifying match. A shocked, disbelieving silence fell over the room, so profound one could hear the buzzing of a fly against a window pane. Mayor Thompson's face, moments before, ruddy with self-satisfaction, darkened to a dangerous purple, his jovial expression replaced by a thunderous, menacing scowl. This is outrageous, Abernathy. An abomination, scurrilous accusations, and rank slander. You are dredging up ancient, unsubstantiated history, malicious hearsay from a man who, by your own admission, was compromised to tarnish a noble charitable endeavor. And you bring this vagrant, this redskin renegade. He gestured contemptuously towards Ash Talon, who stood still as granite to support your vile lies. A man whose people waged war against us, a murderer, for all we know. One of Thompson's men at the back yelled, "He's probably the one dug them holes looking for heathen relics, or buried his own squaws there." Ash Talon stepped forward, then his presence suddenly commanding. Despite his humble attire and the hostility directed at him, he moved with a quiet grace that was more intimidating than any overt threat. "My name is Ash Talon," he said, his voice low, but resonant, carrying to every corner of the packed room, silencing the heckler. "And the woman I loved. My wife Celia, a white woman of this town, is buried on that land, her child, our child with her. She was murdered by the silence and the secrets and the brutal hypocrisy of men like you. Men like your forebears who hide their evil behind masks of piety and power. Her desecrated grave is but one of many." Margaret then spoke, her voice trembling initially, but gaining strength as she met the hostile glares. "I am Margaret Calloway, widow of your late Reverend Alistair Calloway. That land is my home, and I tell you now with God as my witness, it is a graveyard." She paused, her gaze sweeping the stunned faces of the council members. "My late husband supported this retreat, I believe, out of an ignorance fostered by men like Reverend Hawthorne, whose own letter urged Alistair to leave some soil unturned. But we are not ignorant now. We must not build a place of supposed healing on unhallowed ground, upon the very bones of forgotten, murdered victims, whose silenced voices now cry out from the earth. She stepped forward to the council table. Abernathy unlocked and opened the wooden box from which Margaret carefully, reverently laid out the tarnished silver locket. The small carved wooden bird, a fragment of faded blue calico. The pitiful child's shoe. "These belong to them," she said softly. Yet her voice carried an immense weight. To the women who were silenced, to Ilara, with her fiery hair and healing hands, to Celia, who dared to love, to a nameless infant, perhaps one of many, to others whose names we may never know, but whose lives were stolen, whose stories were erased by men who feared their strength, their spirit, their choices, men who valued control over compassion. The council members stared their faces, a disturbing canvas of disbelief, dawning horror, and on some a flicker of guilty comprehension. Councilman Davies, however, sneered openly, his face flushed. Hysterical ramblings from a grieving widow and a savage. "This is a travesty. My grandfather helped build this town. He ensured its purity. These are necessary measures. This is a waste of the council's valuable time." He looked expectantly at Thompson. Mayor Thompson slammed his gavel repeatedly, his face contorted with rage. "This is a circus, a coordinated malicious attempt to derail progress and slander this fine community. These trinkets, these baubles prove nothing. This man Talon is a known renegade, a fugitive from justice. And Mrs. Calloway is, well, clearly a grieving widow, highly suggestible, perhaps addled by loneliness and wild imaginings fed to her by this heathen." He signaled sharply to his thugs at the back. Two of them started to move menacingly towards the table. Their intent clear to seize the box, to silence them, Peter instinctively moved to shield Margaret Ash with a speed that belied his years of hardship. Stepped between the advancing men and the table. One of the thugs lunged for the box. Ash didn't strike. He simply moved a blur of motion, using the man's own momentum to send him sprawling into his companion. Both crashed heavily against the wall. Before they could recover, a few townsmen, ordinary farmers and shopkeepers, shocked into action, stepped forward to block any further advance, their faces grim. The air crackled with tension. "Are you suggesting, Mayor Thompson?" Dr. Abernathy interjected sharply, his voice like a whip crack above the sudden uproar that my late father, Dr. Elijah Abernathy, a respected physician in this town for over 40 years, was a liar. That his detailed contemporaneous medical records and personal journals detailing his own tormented conscience and the horrors he witnessed, are elaborate fabrications, or that I, his son and successor, after being physically assaulted by your cronies this very morning for trying to protect this evidence, would risk my practice, my reputation, my very standing in this community on a baseless, malicious fantasy. He held up his father's journal, then Hawthorne's brittle letter to Alistair, or that Reverend Hawthorne's own letter to Reverend Calloway, explicitly warning him about the unturned soil and the necessary actions of the past on that land, is also a lie. Will you call him a liar too? The direct challenge, the invocation of old Doc Abernathy's unimpeachable name, coupled with the shocking revelation of his coerced witnessing the physical evidence of assault on his son, and the reference to Hawthorne's own words, hung heavy and palpable in the charged air. Several council members, older men who had known and respected the elder Abernathy, looked profoundly troubled and their faces pale. One of them, a grizzled, pragmatic farmer named Jedediah Smith, a man known for his blunt honesty, cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "Mayor," he said slowly, his gaze fixed on the pitiful items on the table, I remember my own mother. God rest her soul, speaking in hushed tones of girls who just disappeared back in those early harder days, no explanations ever given. She called that land by the willow the weeping place. It was always hushed up, forbidden talk, maybe. Maybe there's something to what the good doctor and Mrs. Calloway are saying. Land that close to the old strong house always had. A bad feeling about it. Others murmured hesitant agreement. A few hands that had been poised to vote with Thompson now wavered, then lowered. The carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. The tide, however slightly, was beginning to turn. "This is preposterous. An insult to our town's founders," Thompson blustered his voice. Losing some of its earlier arrogant conviction, a hint of desperation creeping in. The land was surveyed, twice. There were no indications of any irregularities whatsoever. His eyes darted towards the now hesitant thugs, then back to Davies, who looked suddenly alone. "Perhaps your surveyors were not looking for the graves of women deemed inconvenient?" "Mayor Thompson." Ash Talon said, his voice cutting through the mayor's flustered protests like a honed blade. "Perhaps they were only looking for a suitable place to bury new secrets, just as their predecessors did. As you intended to do, perhaps as soon as tonight." This last referencing the note wrapped around the rock caused a fresh wave of murmurs. The confrontation raged for another tense, bitter hour. Thompson and his staunchest allies like Davies fought back with ferocity, accusing, denying, threatening legal action, character assassination. But Margaret Ashe and Dr. Abernathy stood firm, their testimonies unwavering, their evidence. The locket, the bones, the journals, the map, the bruises on Abernathy's face, the very air of authenticity. They exuded the sheer moral weight of their conviction. Undeniably powerful. The crushing weight of the past, once deeply buried and deliberately forgotten, was now pressing down on the present, demanding to be acknowledged, to be reckoned with. Finally, a formal motion was put forward by a visibly shaken Jedediah Smith to immediately suspend all work on the maternity retreat project and to launch a full, impartial investigation into the damning claims to be overseen by a committee that included Dr. Abernathy and, to Mayor Thompson's visible sputtering fury, Margaret Calloway herself. The motion passed by a narrow, fragile margin, a victory snatched from the very jaws of entrenched power and corruption. The aftermath was tumultuous, tearing the town apart. It was thrown into an uproar of accusation, denial, and dawning shame. Some refused to believe, clinging desperately to the curated narrative of progress and piety, accusing Abernathy of grave robbing and Margaret of insanity. Others were profoundly horrified, deeply ashamed, demanding answers, demanding justice for the dead. Eleanor Ainsworth, confronted by a heartbroken Margaret days later with evidence from Doc Abernathy's father's ledgers showing her own family had supplied linens and other goods to the Stronghouse at inflated prices, broke down. She confessed through bitter tears that her family's prosperity had indeed been built on such discreet arrangements. "My father always said it was just business, Margaret, that some women were liabilities to moral order. What could I do? It was our livelihood, our standing." The betrayal was profound. Another layer to Margaret's education in the town's buried sins, the story of the buried daughters of Willow Creek, as they grimly came to be known. Spread like wildfire, carried by travelers, traders, and hastily printed newspapers to neighboring settlements and beyond, a dark stain on the town's reputation. The official investigation was slow, agonizing, and politically fraught. Under the committee's reluctant oversight and with the grudging cooperation of the local sheriff, a Thompson appointee who was swiftly replaced, a more formal, extensive exhumation of several sites was conducted by professionals brought in from the state capital. The findings confirmed everything Ash and Margaret had reported, and more, dozens of graves were ultimately identified. Most unmarked, their occupants, anonymous souls lost to history, but some through recovered artifacts, distinctive dental work noted in Doc Abernathy's father's journals, or cross-referencing with old town and church records of missing women, were given back their names: Celia and her child, Alara, Sarah Mary, Hannah, Agnes Lisbeth, each name a sorrowful whisper from a stolen life. A testament to resilience. Even in obliteration, Mayor Thompson's political career was utterly ruined. His grand benevolent vision for the maternity retreat collapsed under the crushing weight of the horrific scandal. The funding, already precarious, dried up almost overnight as horrified donors, including some distant church bodies Alistair had approached, withdrew their support. The subtle eugenics program, which investigators discovered, had been subtly woven into the retreat's proposed charter under benign-sounding clauses about improving community health and lineage standards, was exposed for the monstrous racist ideology it truly was. Councilman Davies implicated by recovered account books from the old stronghouse, indicating his family had profited from supplying it for decades. Quietly sold his lands and left town under cover of darkness. For Margaret, the journey was profoundly, irrevocably transformative. She had stepped out from the long shadow of her late husband, from the quiet, unquestioning conformity of her previous life, and had found her voice a voice resonant with moral conviction and unyielding strength. She became a driving force in the town's painful, necessary reckoning, advocating tirelessly for the proper, respectful memorialization of the victims. Her land was no longer a place of private solace, but a public trust, a sacred, haunted ground. The memory of Hawthorne's letter and Alistair's acquiescence or deliberate blindness remained a painful spur, reminding her that good intentions were not enough without courageous scrutiny. Ash Talon, too, found a measure of hard-won peace, though the scars on his soul would never fully heal. Celia's story was finally told. Her memory honored not in secret bitter grief, but openly with dignity. He worked alongside Margaret, his quiet presence a constant source of strength for her, as hers was for him, helping to design and create a simple, poignant memorial garden where the ancient willow tree stood, its branches once seeming to weep in sorrow, now seemed to offer a sheltering comfort. Simple, unadorned stone markers were erected, some bearing the recovered names, many simply inscribed. A daughter remembered. She had a name. The wildflowers, once seen by Margaret as a deceptive shroud, were now tended with loving care by both of them. A living, vibrant tribute. Ash, using skills learned from his grandfather, carved a small, intricate Lenape symbol for remembrance and the passage of spirits onto Celia's stone. Onto the marker for their child, he reverently placed the tiny carved wooden bird they had found, a fragile token finally at rest. The town did not easily heal. The wounds were too deep, the betrayal of trust too profound. But for the first time in its history, the full, unvarnished truth of its shadowed past was being confronted, not buried. The buried daughters were no longer dismissed as sinners or wayward women, but acknowledged finally as victims of a brutal, systematic injustice. Their lives stolen, and their stories deliberately erased. Margaret Calloway, once the preacher's grieving widow seeking quiet refuge from the world, became a guardian of memory, a quiet but unyielding voice for justice and truth. She realized that Alistair, in his own tragic way, had also been a victim of the town's carefully constructed edifice of silence and denial, a good man who had at best failed to see the darkness lurking beneath the surface, or at worst chosen comfort over courage. When faced with Hawthorne's knowing words, she could mourn him now, not as an unblemished paragon of virtue, but as a complex, flawed human being, and perhaps eventually forgive him for his unknowing or knowingly ignorant complicity. The proposed maternity retreat, with its sinister underpinnings, was never built. Instead, the salvaged funds, supplemented by new guilt-ridden donations from the shamed community, were redirected towards establishing a small, free public library and a school for girls dedicated to fostering critical thinking, courage, and empowering young women to find and use their own voices. A true sanctuary of hope built not on buried secrets and bones, but on the hard-won, blood-soaked truth. One cool, crisp autumn evening, as the sun bled crimson and gold across the western horizon, Margaret and Ash stood by the willow tree, the memorial garden peaceful and serene in the fading light. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Around Celia's stone, Margaret had planted a profusion of wild columbine. The flower Ash had once told her was Celia's favorite, its delicate spurs reaching towards the sky like tiny, hopeful prayers. Ash was preparing to leave the next morning to rejoin his scattered kin further west, his task here finally done. He held a small, worn deerskin pouch. "They are remembered now," Ash said, his voice quiet, the raw, jagged edge of his lifelong grief softened by a measure of acceptance of closure. Celia, she would be glad of that. And of the flowers, she would know they are not hiding the truth any longer, but honoring it. He opened the pouch and took out a single perfectly preserved blue jay feather, the kind Celia always loved to find and wear in her hair. He gently tucked it amongst the columbine at the base of her stone. "Fly free, my love, fly free, little one." Margaret nodded, a gentle, understanding smile touching her lips. Tears in her eyes. "Yes, Ash, I truly believe she would." She looked at the man beside her. No longer a ragged intruder or a fearsome legend, but a trusted friend, a steadfast partner in an unexpected, earth-shattering journey. His presence was a quiet comfort, a living reminder of the enduring strength found in shared truth, resilience, and the courage to confront the darkest of legacies. The land, once a place of unimaginable horror and deceit, had begun its slow transformation into a place of healing, not just for Ash Talon and Margaret Calloway, but tentatively, painstakingly, for the wounded soul of the town itself. The suffocating silence had been irrevocably broken, and in its place, a more honest, more compassionate, more vigilant future was struggling to take root. Years later, an older Margaret, her hair, now the silver of ashes, had once been sat by her window overlooking the memorial garden. She was writing in a leather-bound journal on the one she had started after the truth came out. On its final page, she wrote, "The willow still stands, its roots run deep, intertwined with sorrow. Yes, but also with remembrance. The whispers have not entirely faded, but now they speak of names known, lives honored." Hawthorne warned Alistair that some soil is best left unturned. He was wrong. Some soil must be turned again and again, lest the roots of old evils find new purchase in the dark. This ground is now tilled with truth. It is our vigil, our promise to those who sleep beneath and to those who will come after. We will not forget. We will not be silent again. She closed the journal. The sun was setting, and the branches of the willow swayed gently, as if nodding in agreement, the kind that came from choosing to stand for something essential, even when the cost was almost unbearable, and from knowing that even the deepest, darkest graves could not forever hold back the eventual, inevitable dawn of justice.